Welcome back to another episode of SaaS Buyers Club. I'm your host, Omeed.
And I'm your co-host, Joe.
And this week we have Thomas Smale from FE International. Thanks for joining us, Thomas.
Hey guys, thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, so why don't we start by having you just tell the audience a little bit about you and your background and the work that you do.
Sure. So I'm the founder and CEO of FE International. I started the company in 2010 when this world of M&A did not really exist. SaaS was only just becoming a thing. People were buying tech businesses, but not at any sort of scale. So we were very early on. It was very much the Wild West. If I wanted to find a podcast to go talk about this kind of stuff or learn about it, it did not exist. So you guys are kind of trailblazers from that perspective. But I was very early in the space. It's obviously matured a lot since then. Now as a firm, we specialize in tech M&A. So that's anything from software, e-commerce, digital media, service companies, anything that uses tech, essentially. It's something that we would work on and represent. We're primarily sell-side advisors. We generally work with founder or the owner of a business to help sell it, but we also do some buy-side work, valuation work, due diligence work, various other things for people who might be interested in M&A or anything related to investment banking. Over the years, our team have closed over 1,500 deals in excess of 50 billion in transaction volume. We currently describe ourselves as a lower middle market to middle market M&A. So generally deals up to 300 million in value is what you'd generally describe middle market as, and anything below that as well. So we work on a real range of deals. Our headquarters is New York, so I'm currently sat it's very cold in New York at the moment in our New York office. But as our name suggests, we are international, so we have a team all over the world. We have an office in Miami, San Francisco, London, Mumbai, and various other places as well.
That's great. That's great. You know, I was going to ask a few things about your scope there, but I feel like I completely understand what you guys are doing. Your deal sizes, your geographic location, the type of businesses you represent. Are there any other things you'd like to tell us about introducing FE International?
No, I think that's a pretty good overview. I mean, over the years, we very much developed as a firm. We started out selling small businesses where no one was really doing M&A in the space. And then we've transitioned to where the majority of the deals we're working on at the moment are 8 or 9 figures in valuation as the market has matured. Back in 2010, if you wanted to sell a software company for 50 million, there was essentially no one you could call who would know anything about that. You would either call a big investment bank who would hang up the phone on you because the deal is too small, or you'd be calling your local business broker who knew how to sell a gas station but has no idea how to sell a tech business. So we've kind of moved with the market. As the market's got more mature, I guess we've got more mature and continued to go up market in terms of deal size and sophistication.
That's awesome. You know, I feel like we're going to be able to talk about a lot of really useful things and really helpful things for the audience regarding just tech, SaaS, M&A in general, due to your guys' extensive experience. But before we get into talking about deals and some lessons learned, why don't we learn a little bit more about your history, if you would enlighten us, before founding FE International? And also I have another sort of background question I'll ask there too about, you could answer secondly, about what does it look like typically for somebody to come and work with you guys and the process there?
Sure. So I guess in terms of personal background, I started FE, I was 22. I just graduated college. That year was 2010. So for those of you who remember back to 2010, I did a business degree. Most of my kind of peers either went to work for an accounting firm, an investment bank, or a consulting firm. That was basically all everyone did. That year, most investment banks were originally hiring and then stopped hiring. So lots of people suddenly had job offers that didn't exist, me being one of them. And I decided to give running my own business a go. And at the time I'd been, I don't know, the technical term might be like dabbling, had been messing around online for maybe 3 or 4 years. Previously, I was doing very small deals myself, and by very small, I'm talking about $100, $1,000, tiny deals, but learning the process of buying and selling and learning the industry. 2010, I wrote a book about how to sell websites, essentially. It was back then. Business owners then approached me and said, hey, I've read your book. Can you just help me sell my business? So that's then how we fell into M&A, somewhat opportunistic, because I was a college kid with no money. So how do you buy businesses if you have no money? You can't. But could still apply everything I knew by helping people sell. So that was very early days of M&A. We built a lot of subject matter expertise, a lot of like trust in the industry because we were very, very small deals. And then we really just continued moving up from there. I was fortunate the business did well enough in 2010 to pay my rent pay for some food, open our first office, hire our first 2 employees. One actually still works for us today, like nearly 14 years on. So yeah, we're very early from that perspective. In terms of how we work with clients, we've actually been very similar since day one. So we've always been very heavily word of mouth reliant. So if you are a founder and you sell your business, you probably then go tell your friends about that deal. And chances are, if you're a founder, being a founder is a lonely world. Most of your other friends are probably founders. So we get a lot of word of mouth from people who have sold their business. They go tell their friends and their peers, and then those people come to us and when they decide to sell. So we've always very much been inbound word of mouth in terms of how people find us. And then our process, obviously, it's developed in terms of sophistication, but it's very much been, we've always offered free valuations from the start. So if you come to us with a business, we'll put together a free valuation, which is essentially an assessment of what we think it's worth, what the market's like, how long it might take to sell, if it's actually sellable right now, and various other factors like that. And then we work all the way through the process. If they're happy to proceed and they say, yeah, I want to sell my $50 million business, we'll sign an engagement agreement with them. We then work through an audit process where we have an in-house audit team, conduct a financial audit, operational audit, legal, technical, various other elements of audit. We'll learn as much as we can about the business. We put together a SIM, or confidential information memorandum. There's lots of technical terms you might hear it be called, but we currently call it a SIM. Team put that together. Simultaneously, we're putting together lists of buyers we're going to reach out to. So it might be buyers already in our network that we're familiar with. It might be buyers we've never spoken to before that we think will be a good fit. And a combination of those two. Some of it could be word of mouth, like we know someone that might be interested, or they know someone that might be interested. But we're very detailed with our outreach from that perspective. Once we have the SIM complete, the seller or the sellers are happy, we'll then go out to market. We approach buyers. We'll run generally a bidding process with a deadline. So 31st of January or whatever it might be, its deadline. We'll negotiate the transaction from there. And then hopefully once we've negotiated a deal, we get into due diligence. Generally at that stage, attorneys get brought in from either side, accountants get brought in from either side, like buyer and seller. And our job is very much middleman. So we're kind of in the middle of the buyer and seller, in the middle of attorneys, in the middle of accountants. Our job is to essentially make sure deal happens and make sure the commercial terms are reasonable. While we're not necessarily qualified attorneys, a lot of, as you guys know, like a lot of law is finding a fair middle ground on points that the parties care about and want to negotiate on, and some things that you can make concessions on, some things you can't make concessions on. And then ultimately the art of good M&A is finding concessions and fair middle ground throughout the whole process. It's not quite as glamorous as people think from the movies or whatever. So a lot of it is that. And then from there, we hopefully close the transaction. Generally, our relationship with the seller doesn't end there. Often founders are serial founders who go launch another business. Maybe they already did launch another business. We work with a lot of people who'll then come back and sell a business. 2 years later, we actually had a client who sold a business with us in 2023. He sold another business with us in 2021 and his first business with us in 2012. So we've definitely gone through a cycle with quite a few entrepreneurs over the years. And obviously part of our job as well is making sure that if a deal has any contingent elements, if there's an earn out or if there's kind of ongoing seller financing, that we're there to help the seller collect on that. Not that we're a collections agency, but a big part of it is even just like the administration of collecting payments and making sure that the business is going well and like everyone's happy and things are moving forward smoothly post sale. Because as you guys know, it can be a very emotional process. So often a lot of our time is we're the buffer, the middle ground for buyer and seller. And then our job afterwards is to make sure that the buyer and seller still get on really well. And if there's any kind of contention, the contention is between us and them because they think we're the ones that have caused the last minute changes or whatever it might be.
100%. No, that's super helpful information. I really like the details you've given us there. I even like your emphasis also on, the emotional aspects of transactions, which can often be overlooked and hard to learn about in a book if you don't have a trusted advisor telling you what's going on and what you should do. But I've been hogging the mic a little bit. Omeed, why don't you take over?
Yeah, I kind of have just some fun questions for you, Thomas. If you could go back in time, would you still choose sell side?
Yes.
Okay. Why?
I can elaborate if you want.
Yes.
I think the primary thing with sellers when they want to sell is firstly, we'll only take on a seller if they're already successful. So they already have a good business. And most people are very sure about the fact they want to sell when they get to that stage. If you ask if you go interview 100 founders today, if you walk around New York and go find 100 founders, how many of you want to sell your business tomorrow? 99% of them will say, no, I'm keeping my business, I'm not selling. The one who does want to sell will be motivated and they'll want to sell. If you go ask 100 random people on the street on New York, do you want to buy a business? Probably, I don't know, 50% of them would say, yes, I want to buy a business. How many of them have the money to buy a business? In New York, a higher percentage than some cities, but most people know, particularly not the size of business they want to buy. A lot of people just like the idea of buying a business because it sounds cool, or they've respectfully listened to a podcast and said you should buy a business, or they found a course on buying a business, or just like, I'm not from the US, but American dream is like kind of buy and run your own business is very much culturally ingrained in this country, or my new adopted homeland. So I think that's part of it. Is like we're primarily contingency only business. We get paid if deals closed. Yes, we might have retainers. Yes, we might have other fees along the way, but our primary business is based on success fees. So you have a much higher success rate working with sellers who are motivated to sell rather than buyers who think they want to buy a business. Because in my experience, many people who think they want to buy a business never do. And you might have to 100,000 businesses until you decide what's a good fit. So there's just far too many variables that go into representing buyers. That said, where we do represent buyers, it's generally if they have acquired businesses before and they know exactly what they want. They're like, hey guys, we've deployed $100 million. We've bought 5 software companies that look like X. Can you go find more companies that look like X? Yes, we're very good at that. We have a good reputation. People answer our emails. People like answer phone calls, read our LinkedIn messages, whatever it might be, because they know we're a kind of serious firm with a good reputation. As a buyer, it's much harder to stand out because most founders get 10 emails a day from random associates out in Boston who says they work for a private equity firm and they want to buy a business. There's almost a unlimited number of those. There's a relatively small number of like trusted advisors that people know are serious on both sides of the table.
Right. So if you find that buyer, for example, who you can put your name behind and go to, these sellers that are selling their businesses, you're more than happy to work with those kind of vetted buyers in that respect, is what I'm hearing.
Exactly. Generally when we do buy side work, it's for people we already have an existing relationship. And it's somewhat the same with sellers. Like, it's very uncommon for someone to call us and say, hey, I want to sell my business tomorrow. Can you help? And then assign an engagement agreement within a week. Most of the clients we work with have been familiar with us, maybe met us, spoken to us before for often many years before they decide it's time to move on.
Another kind of just fun question, just to kind of get the conversation kicked off, is like, you mentioned there's the American dream aspect. There's the kind of craze that we're seeing right now of everyone is talking about buying a business. Have you ever bought a business?
I have. So the day one of FE wasn't actually M&A. It was me buying myself. The caveat was I had $100 to my name. So it's not the exciting story that everyone thinks it was back then. It's very small. At the moment, yes. So this is not a hard and fast rule, but generally speaking, every year my business partner and I buy one business, which is generally separate from FE, so it doesn't overlap, but it's still in the space. Our logic has always been, I think it's difficult to be a good advisor if you've never done it yourself before, because of all the emotional, like you say, you can read 1,000 books on how to do these things until you've actually done it. It's not quite what the book tells you. Yes, the textbook might say X, but that doesn't deal with the person who might have a last minute change of heart just because they've changed their mind. There's no rational reason. It's just they've changed their mind. You can't go back to, what about if we change cell C4 from 10,000 to 20,000? Does that change your mind? No. So there's no textbook way around it. Also, just from a financial perspective, like, I'm very fortunate to have built a good business, like, generates profit, make distributions. What am I going to do with that money? Am I going to go buy real estate? I don't know anything about real estate. I know about this industry. So I've always thought it's been good from that perspective, just kind of putting my money where my mouth is. Why would anyone want to come and work for me if I'm not like all in on the industry? And why would you want to become a client of ours if I've not physically put my own money up in the past. So yeah, we always have. We've tried to keep it as separate as we can. Separate team. I've always felt it's been quite beneficial as long as it's not too much of a conflict of interest and as long as it's not too much of a time distraction.
Can you talk to us about some of those businesses in the portfolio? Like maybe tell us about one or two of them?
Not in a huge amount of detail because we try and keep it all completely separate. Primarily by software companies, obviously because that's the space we know. Generally, we keep operationally hands off. So we work with we generally hire a CEO. When we started out, there were tiny businesses. We've got significantly larger now. So our portfolio is in the kind of mid 8-figure revenue range annually. So we generally hire a CEO now if we buy a business and have them run it. Sometimes we co-invest with clients. So often a client will sell their business similar to us and I'll say, okay, I've just made $20 million. What am I supposed to do with it? We don't necessarily offer financial advice. So in the past, we've done deals where clients have like invested alongside us and they know the space as well. We're like, well, we're going to buy a software business. We know the space, you know the space. It makes perfect sense. But we don't want to run the day-to-day. I already have one business to run. And while running a business might seem glamorous, running multiple businesses certainly is not. So having a reliable CEO in place for each business is good. But no, generally speaking, B2B SaaS, we generally like things which are boring and, I guess, private. Like if you research, you wouldn't be able to figure out what we're necessarily running. And we've always liked it that way. Obviously, the flip side of that argument is, hey, Thomas, quite a few people know you. You're on podcasts, you're on stage quite a lot. Why not buy a business that would be like synergistic with FE? There's almost an unlimited number of things we could do. Like if I really wanted to just make extra money on the side, maybe I should launch a book about buying businesses or a course or a conference or whatever it might be. We've always tried to keep it separate. And I guess it's similar to kind of diversifying your investments. It's in a space I'm familiar with, but I don't have to run the day to day and it kind of be hands off. And because we buy boring businesses, they're the kind of businesses which grow 50% a year. They're never going to grow 500%, but they'll grow steadily, consistently. We've been fortunate to have generated some really good returns. Like last year, we just had a business we acquired three years ago, and we just sold it for about 4 times what we paid, plus the cash all the way through. So we've had some pretty good success there as well. And obviously, because of the fact we built an M&A firm, we have that. One of the big problems if you're building a portfolio of businesses is liquidity. We own and run an M&A firm. So if anyone should know when and how to sell a business, it's us. So that's been a useful platform and foundation to have behind us as we've gone along.
Let's talk about that. When and how to sell a business.
That's great. Yeah. Omeed, give me 1 second. Give me
no
1
worries.
second. I gotta
give him a second until he gets back. Yeah, I kind of see some good themes emerging here, Thomas, in terms of, I really love the concept of the art of M&A and like really digging into that. And then when and how to sell a business. I mean, I think the way that you just highlighted that in terms of your positioning, kind of giving you the key indicators of when that is like so interesting to dive into, because it sounds like it's something that is of great expertise for you. How do those kind of two directions for the conversation sound? Is there anything else specifically that you'd like to focus on or think that would be really valuable?
No, honestly, you guys know the audience better than me. I don't have any like ulterior motive. At the end, I'm not going to surprise launch a product that I haven't told you guys about. I'm, your audience, happy to talk about it. And most of us I get interviewed on don't really talk about deals. So like, oh, what are valuations at the moment? Kind of all the stuff that everyone wants to know, but can't really answer with any degree of accuracy. If you ask me personally, I love just talking about negotiation dynamics and how to do deals. I can talk about that stuff all day long. That's what I get up for in the morning. It's not valuation multiples.
Yeah, that sounds like a fun topic. No, 100%. Yeah, we'll ask some questions around there that, in light of what we've done this so many times now, where we just kind of naturally think of the questions and ask that are on point for the subject matter. So, Omeed, apologies for the little break there, but please go back to what you were asking.
No, totally. Yeah. So, Thomas, to kind of dive back in, the last thing that I heard you say is, given your positioning as, an M&A firm, you know when and how to sell a business. So let's talk a little bit about that. Like, what are the kind of key primary things that you'd have to say about when to sell a business?
I think, firstly, if you take out all of the business elements, if you're at least a founder and you only own one business, it's a personal decision. So when you should sell is personal. You could ask 100 different people who will give you 100 different answers. But generally speaking, objectively, I think the best time to sell is when the business has reached its limit, not necessarily upper limit, but its limit with your management of how big it's going to get. And that has to have a little bit of a cross section with what your financial number is personally to exit and walk away from your company. And that number varies. Some people it's 10 million, 20 million, 100 million, billion. There's definitely no right or wrong answer. I'd say the average semi-successful person comes in somewhere between 20 and 100 million as their go number of not necessarily never have to work again, but like very comfortable for life or potentially a couple of generations at least if they manage their money well. So often it's literally just that. Some people arbitrarily decide to sell because their business has now hit that valuation goal. Most people combine that with some personal element. I am tired. Can just specifically be as that I've been working 80 hours a week for 10 years. I would like a break. Some people decide because they have another business. We work with a lot of clients who have another idea or another business that's taking off and they just want to start working on that and they want to be able to focus their time there. There's a real mix. I don't necessarily think there's a right or wrong answer. See, technically, if you read the MBA textbook, the MBA textbook will tell you you should probably sell like while your business is still growing. Obviously, that's important. Circumstances don't necessarily always work like a textbook. So sometimes people don't necessarily always get to sell their business at the right time. But say the opposite of that, the worst time to sell is when not necessarily you've already given up, but there's already a problem in the business. It's already started declining. While we don't have time today to have an entire conversation about valuation, generally speaking, a growing business is going to be worth significantly more in terms of a multiple than a business that's not growing. So growing, getting close to your go number personally, or at least like a stepping stone. I'm also a big believer, as kind of someone at least who started with nothing. I think the first 1 to 2 million you make is the most life-changing because you can, depending where you live, you can probably buy a house, you can pay off debt, you can get into a position where you're not set for life, but you're financially comfortable and it can take some pressure off. So we've definitely worked with a lot of founders who have decided to take some chips off the table relatively early, just because financially it will then set them up to then take a bigger swing with their next business. Hence the client I mentioned who sold a business in 2012 and then a couple in the last few years. Each business, each time he's come back has been slightly bigger than the last. I think that's quite a good way to do it. Other founders are different. They're like, well, I'm like a generation, I'm just going to make one business. That's all I'm ever going to do in my life. Then I'm going to sell it and then I'm going to retire. That's fine as well. Some people have that more serial entrepreneur mentality. Some people don't. So again, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but your business is growing, you're close to your go number, and it's time for you personally to move on. It's probably the best time to sell.
Yeah, and I hear that being prudent advice that the market, and when I compare it against, the lower middle market, I'm not necessarily sure everyone follows that advice, especially for a lot of those listing platforms, for example. I think the statistic that we hear is like 90% of businesses will never sell, for example. So I think if more people kind of followed that advice, because that advice is pretty consistent. Even we say we have a concept that's called the exit sweet spot, right? The exit sweet spot is, sell your business at its greatest value. Why wouldn't you do that as opposed to waiting until it declines, for example, or you get burnt out and you just don't want to be in the business anymore, which will ultimately result in the decline of the business anyway. So yeah, I mean, that totally makes sense. Joe, is there anything you'd want to kind of throw in, add, any thoughts?
No, it all aligns, with a lot of stuff we talk about. It makes a lot of sense. It's pretty fundamental stuff. So no, please carry on.
Awesome. Yeah. So kind of moving on from that aspect of the conversation of like when and how to sell the business, totally makes sense. You brought up a term or a saying that I really love, the art of M&A, in terms of, M&A is a really complex field. I think you brilliantly exemplified it in, one of the dynamics that makes M&A complex is, well, when you're engaging with a seller, for example, changing, some numerical value in some cell on some spreadsheet isn't necessarily going to change the sentiment of the seller if they've changed their mind halfway through a deal, because so much of it is human dynamic. So talk to us a little bit more about this concept of the art of M&A. Can you put your thumb on it in terms of, can you break it down maybe into its essential parts and help? I know.
Yeah. So I think,
So that's a big question.
I think so. M&A is to caveat and take a bit of a middle ground. M&A is an art and a science. You have to do M&A well. at scale, like we have like over 1,500 times, over 50 billion in transaction volume, you have to technically be very good. So every single person I've hired is technically, hopefully better than me. They're technically excellent. I'd say that's almost a given, but in the world of M&A, almost everyone you come across will be technically good. So,
and talk to us about that. Talk to us about that technical aspect in terms of when you say technically good, like what is it that makes them technically good?
So I guess by technically good, I don't mean like they're a programmer or a developer. I mean, can be basic skills like, I kind of made that stupid joke about Excel, but like Excel skills are super important. Financial knowledge is important. You don't necessarily have to be an accountant, although many of our team members are a CPA or have a similar financial qualification, because fundamentally a lot of businesses are sold based on their financials. We have a lot of people with traditional M&A training and experience, often from bigger investment banks. So it could be as simple as, can they make a DCF, like a discounted cash flow model from scratch? There's various other models that you can build, and I think that's definitely helpful if you're negotiating with sophisticated buyers who are building their own DCF. If you don't know how to do it, then you're probably going to get out negotiated just from a technical perspective. So it's an absolute given that you have the technical knowledge. Otherwise, you're going to fall apart, particularly as deals get bigger. If you're doing a $10,000 deal, doesn't really matter. There's no one really technical at that level. It's very much like, often the numbers are quite arbitrary. As deals get bigger, I'd say the technical element is important, but you really differentiate yourself with the art of M&A, with the more subjective things that you don't necessarily pick up on. The most technical person in the world won't necessarily pick up on that kind of emotional element, or I think some people might describe me as like neurotic or a micromanager, because I'll pick up on like very small details. Someone has mentioned, like a client might have said something, and I'm like, I think we have a problem because they said this. And it could be all sorts of very small things you only really pick up on once you've done it lots of times. And it can be like as simple things, like you might identify there's a problem if someone misses a scheduled call and then they don't answer an email immediately. It might seem innocuous because yes, sometimes people miss meetings. Not everyone answers their email immediately. Not everyone picks up their phone. But sometimes that could mean, or maybe there's a problem. Maybe they're getting cold feet. Maybe we should have positioned something differently from that perspective. That's, I think, the kind of things you only really learn after a while. So there's lots of very nuanced things like that, which are kind of impossible to put into writing because you can't really explain it until you see it. And if you do try and explain it, it doesn't really make sense unless you see it in context. And often it has to be in the context of lots of sequential things that have happened. Kind of like the compounding effect of the behavioral things that have happened in the deal to get to the stage where like, well, it completely makes sense that this has now happened because 6 months ago they said this and this. So if you put 2 and 2 together, you realize that the answer is this because of all of these things. So I don't think there's any way, at least I've not figured it out. And if I did, I'd probably be not talking to you guys today. I'd be sat on a beach, not having to work. But I don't think there's any way you can teach the art of M&A without actually doing it. I think you have to physically do deals, be negotiating with people. I think the technical element, and while the science and the technical part you can't ignore, I think it's somewhat commoditized. All of our, like, a lot of the people we kind of compete with or hire from, everyone is technically good. Like 100% of people can do all of the technical things. I say you don't differentiate yourself by being technically good. It's also not really a competitive advantage. Similar to when people say things like, pricing is not a competitive advantage, being the cheapest is not, because ultimately you just end up in a race to the bottom because one day, regardless of what industry you're in, someone will launch something cheaper. And if that's your only differentiating factor, and that's very basic. I mean, you can learn that stuff in like a business class when you're 16 years old. That's quite basic business theory. But when it comes to negotiation, a lot of these things you just don't know until you've kind of been there and done it. But you have to have the technical knowledge at the same time. Otherwise, it's essentially impossible and you're just like guessing. You can't, while I say like maybe moving cell C3 and D4 around and changing the number from 10,000 to 20,000 doesn't necessarily affect a deal. Oftentimes it does. And actually the solution is a rational one. It is actually just making a few changes to a financial model, and then you get to a level which everyone is happy with. It also depends a lot who you're negotiating with. If you're working with a lot of buyers particularly, will be quite technical from a perspective, like from a qualification perspective. So they want to negotiate with numbers. They'll be very rational and unemotional because they want to negotiate with numbers. A lot of founders won't be like that at all. They'll be a bit more like me. I'm very much, if you ask me in private, I'm all about like spirit of deal. Not that I would ever suggest doing a deal off a handshake, but that's more my philosophy on business. Like, do I trust you? yes, we should sign a contract, but I have to be able to look you in the eyes and trust you. And there's not really a way you can kind of act or like change that. It's very much just like a personal judgment and personal opinion. So I think they're the things that are much harder to control in a deal.
Interesting. Okay. So, yeah, go ahead, Joe. Yeah, please.
I like that. I want to, Omeed, I steer a little bit. I know we were kind of generally being like Art of M&A. I mean, it's such a broad topic. It's literally the topic, So I kind of want to steer us a little bit towards talking in specifics about maybe some non-basic negotiation strategies, more of that human side of M&A that I guess negotiation you could call technical, but very much it's these soft skills and things you might, maybe with your level of experience, you might have words for various strategies and things you do. Sometimes it's just intuition or, you don't have a word for it. But if there's some really cool things or skills, strategies, tactics that you think would be useful for somebody selling or buying their first business to learn about, or maybe just even the approach to negotiation, that'd be a cool topic to kind of reach into, I think.
Yeah, so I think fundamentally, people buy from people. So in a world where many people think they're quite unique and they're like, I've got this really unique idea of buying a software business that's growing 50% year on year, has low churn, can be run remotely, is super profitable, is evergreen, has a CEO in place, and the owner doesn't do anything. Spoiler alert, you're not the only person who's looking to buy a business like that. There's lots of other people like you out there. So to differentiate yourself, you don't differentiate yourself by saying you have an MBA or anything like that. Again, spoiler alert, lots of people have an MBA. Lots of people have cash. It's one thing I've learned, particularly moving to the US. There's a vast amount I think there's $4 trillion of dry powder with private equity firms at the moment. There's a vast amount of capital. You are never going to be the richest person in the room. So if you're trying to compete on that, you're not going to win. I think particularly small deals, let's say sub 100 million, or maybe even sub 300 million, like that personal connection is important. So say the fundamental as a buyer or seller, the most important thing is like being professional, but being yourself, trying not to get too emotional, but don't be afraid to show the human side. Often when deals get challenging and they kind of might fall apart, they're rescued from the human element. They're not rescued because of the spreadsheet. Now the numbers all suddenly match and click and then the deal gets done. They often, when deals are contentious, the difference between that deal happening or that deal not happening is because the buyer and seller fundamentally get on. Don't necessarily have to like personally be best buddies and we'll go hang out for the rest of their lives together, but they'll professionally respect each other. So that's important. I think too many people come into transactions and try and be like way too stiff and technical, or like they'll have their criteria list and they'll absolutely not move off their criteria list. They'll say, well, I need these 10 things. If I don't get these 10 things, there's no deal. I think the best buyers are also the most pragmatic. They know what their non-negotiable factors are, but they're also willing to make some concessions. Otherwise, I know there's a popular book by Chris Voss called like Never Split the Difference. I don't comment on this very often myself, but part of my negotiation strategy is usually, I think in most cases, splitting the difference is the best approach to negotiation. I think in almost all deals, there is a middle ground to be made. The key, and this is, I guess, the second tip after like being yourself. And if you are yourself, you also have to accept that, and this definitely comes with age as well and maturity. A lot of people just won't like you, and that's nothing you can really do about that. You shouldn't try to change yourself. Sometimes deals just won't happen because people don't click, and sometimes deals will happen because they do click. And often the winning bidder will not necessarily be the highest bid. They'll often be the person that the seller likes the most, or vice versa. If someone's looking to buy a business and they're maybe looking to make an offer on 3, often they'll go with and all 3 founders want to take that deal. They'll often go with the founder they think they like the most or believe in the most or whatever it might be. So I think that's always fundamentally important. That sometimes that might just mean if you're a seller, you have to talk to a lot of buyers because you're not going to like everyone. And as a buyer, you're going to have to speak to a lot of sellers because you're not going to like everyone. You can't. Well, I think that if we're going to of being very good at M&A, as an advisor at least, art of being very good at M&A, and the difference between people who are good and very good is being able to change their negotiation style depending on who they're working with. Most people are one-dimensional in their negotiation approach. They'll be very aggressive or very pragmatic, or there'll be probably 10 different personality types you can have for negotiation. Someone who's really good will be able to kind of switch. They'll know when to be aggressive. They'll know when to be pragmatic. They'll know when to be technical. They'll know when to use long words. They'll know when to use short words. They'll know when to pick up the phone. They'll know when it should be an email. There's lots of different styles, but I think being great at M&A is being able to do all of those things, which only really comes with time. Most people starting out just have one approach, which I think is fine and unavoidable. And I think also as a buyer and seller, you have to be genuine. You have to be yourself. I think trying to kind of switch like Jekyll and Hyde, like changing your personality day to day doesn't really work. If you're trying to buy a business, like ultimately you're buying someone's baby, essentially. They want to have that connection. So that's important. Number two, I think, is being very clear with yourself what the most important things are for you. And then I guess part of our job as the middlemen or middle women is, let's just say 10 things that the buyer wants, 10 things that the seller wants. How do we, and this is my version of you should split the difference. Where are the things that it matters to the buyer, it doesn't matter to the seller, should be an easy concession. Matters to both. It's probably a case of meeting somewhere in the middle, maybe in exchange for a compromise elsewhere. I think often people get way too hung up on like binary lists. Like, well, I need these 20 things. My deal must have this every single time. I'm not going to make a concession. And this is where getting on with people is important. I think some people are just way too stubborn over stupid small points that no one really cares about, or you shouldn't really care about, just for arbitrary point scoring exercise. Like, oh, well, I got 15 points of my negotiation. They only got 3. Therefore, I won. But the reality is you didn't really win because the deal probably won't happen. And if it does, you're probably not going to have a particularly good reputation. No one's going to work with you again. I think if one thing I've learned being in business 14 years is kind of reputation compounds. I don't know, there's kind of a cliche saying that like takes a lifetime to build and you can kind of lose it overnight. But I do think that's true. I think if you continuously do the right thing and kind of behave professionally on an ongoing basis, that will follow you around and it will lead to kind of good things happening. And if you do the opposite of that, you may well be successful in the short term, but I think long term, that's not the right way to go. Particularly in the world of M&A, like it's a small world. People, well, they won't legally send each other emails being, do not work with this company. That like the reality is world will get around if you kind of behave badly or screw people over. Even if you get a win and like your deal might close once, you're probably not going to close that second deal. So I think they're really the two most important things. I think as a buyer as well, like similar to your negotiation points with your criteria when you're looking, you have to be pragmatic as well. No one buys a business that hits every point on their initial search checklist. And if it does, you probably have to make a concession on your, for most buyers, most important point, which is valuation. If it checks all your boxes, you're probably going to have to, in your mind at least, overpay for that business. And there's always a buyer out there who is willing to pay more, or usually someone willing to pay more, because they might see something in the business that you don't as a buyer. So a lot of people don't understand. We'll often do deals and the business will sell for, again, without going down the valuation rabbit hole, business might sell for 8 times EBITDA. You have 7 other buyers who want us to buy it and they want to buy it for 5 times EBITDA, and they physically can't understand why anyone would pay 8 times because, again, back to the spreadsheet, according to their DCF, it's only worth 5 times. Like, what assumptions can you plug into your DCF to make it worth 8 times? There's nothing. The difference is for the person paying 8 is they're like, well, this could be completely random. I know how to double this business because I can call up the biggest supplier, or I can call up the biggest partner and I can improve our rate, or I can change this overnight. Therefore, your model is irrelevant because I'm going to throw it out the window on day one when I take over the business. They're the things you really can't control for. So I think a lot of buyers don't really understand that. They assume that kind of it's a fair level playing field and everyone has kind of asymmetric information, but that's not really true. People have access to different information, different skills. Not everyone buys based on the technically correct multiple, even though the consensus might be that it's a number. There's usually someone willing to pay more.
That makes sense. Yeah, I hear you there. I mean, I think those human factors and that more, I could say non-technical, but then can't everything be described technically at some point? Those more artistic or human factors are super important. Especially when we come across first-time buyers, they tend to be like, hey, it's like, this is the multiple I'm looking for, or this is the type of financials I'm looking for, the type of location and stuff. And that's kind of where the analysis ends. And I'm not trying to generalize everybody. A lot of people come from different backgrounds if they enter M&A. And we see a lot of people coming into M&A mid-career they have money, they want to invest, change from their profession and to become a business owner. And when they do that, they don't have all that M&A experience usually. And so a lot of these soft factors can be really huge. And that's one thing, obviously, as attorneys, if we see something, we call it out. Actually, Omeed has been really good he's really good at sensing if if the seller something's odd going wrong with the seller, he'll be the first person out of the whole group of everybody involved in the transaction to say something to me. And we're at the point now where, we're quicker to tell people to pull a deal that needs to be pulled than we were previously, for example, based off of kind of just sensing soft factors. So I really like that detail. Omeed, do you have any follow-up questions about that you might want to ask, or whichever way you want to take this conversation?
Yeah, I really loved when you brought up kind of the soft aspect of the, kind of breaking the art of M&A into the technical, and then, the more soft aspect, and how you mentioned, you called it neuroticism. I don't characterize it that way myself, but I do see how it is like that, because I do the same thing with Joe too, where I'm like, wait a second, seller, presented at the initial meeting this way, and then they started saying these things, and I'll like pick apart all the little things and I love that kind of stuff. That's like my favorite part of deals. So I love that you brought that up.
Yeah. And just to cut in a little bit, just to kind of vibe with Omeed there. And so I come from like the big firm background where it's more technical and you're really used to working with. The other side is also a big firm representing a big strategic buyer or whatever. Everybody's super sophisticated. So you can really kind of trust generally. And if somebody on the other side seems terse or makes a sly comment or something, you're not going to, you might not read into it in the way you may. If it's a first-time buyer who doesn't have the sophisticated experience, there's definitely more human things that arise in those transactions. And Omeed, early on, Omeed would always be like, Joe, like, what the hell is this? And I'll be like, this is early on dealing with small deals because after working at big firms. And I would be like, whatever. I mean, that's not relevant. And ultimately, like 6 months later, we'd learn that it was a signal for some bull crap. We definitely have seen a lot in like bull crap in the low market. Yeah.
Seller pulls the deal, or the other, and I'm like, it's so obvious. How could you not see that seller and buyer clearly didn't get along? Like, they just don't get along. Like, their personalities don't match. Like,
stuff like that.
Yeah. Like, and it is really things like that, really, that I think can really only be learned, from the practice itself, in terms of, I think people need to stub their toe a few times before they figure out, like, oh, I should probably buy businesses from people that, are a cultural fit in terms of, the shoes that I'm going to step in, for example. But so really love that. I'm curious, do you have any, we really love stories on SaaS Buyers Club as a podcast, because I think that they really exemplify, concepts in really concrete ways. Do you have like maybe a story that you could tell us of a deal where that kind of art of M&A side of things really presented itself for you? Is there anything that comes to mind?
And you don't need to say the name.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked on a lot of deals, so I've seen a lot of different things. I think we worked on a deal a couple of years ago. It was a relatively large transaction. We had a seller who was very, very technically smart, but socially terrible. Like, he was a very good example of someone who needed to hire an M&A firm, because by himself he had literally no chance of selling business. The buyer was very similar to the buyer Joe was describing. Very large private equity firm, very sophisticated, extremely professional. So everything for them was by the book. The only actual people in their entire team is large multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. The only person who actually was good at getting past the seller being really awkward was actually the most senior partner, because he had worked on so many deals before, and he's like, I've seen this before. The more junior people were technically fantastic, but they had no idea how to deal with. In this case, it was the founder. I remember I kind of had to escort him to a due diligence meeting, and these are things that would like, not that I ever really went to school for M&A, but he like slept through the due diligence meeting. So I had to like wake him up, like literally knocking on the door of his apartment. And this meeting was at like 12 p.m. And he was like, "Oh, I forgot to set my alarm. I've gone out like drinking last night. I forgot." And then he would turn up to the meeting, and I would obviously be very professional. I said, "But like terribly sorry, like I was late. I got stuck." And then the client was like, "Oh, I was really hungover. I went out last night. Have you got any coffee?" And it's like, how do you prepare for that? Because like, how do you prepare for it? Because I'm like, well, I'll prepare for it by, as a middleman, I'm always used to making excuses and kind of blaming myself or team or whatever for that situation. But I've seen some examples where, I guess the art of M&A is like, ultimately in that case, the buyers knew the business was a good fit. And if you look at all of their criteria list, seller being super professional, yes, it's kind of a hope you have. But the reality for them is we flip it into an opportunity for them and say, well, if this is how the kind of founder behaves in a meeting when he's about to receive like an 8-figure check, personally, there's no outside equity holders. Like, how does he run the business? You guys know everything about running a business. Surely this is a good opportunity for you, because you buy the business, and maybe if you like turn up at 9 a.m. every day and just work a full day, you're going to be ahead of the founder who sleeps till midday on one of the most important days of life. So I think things like that, you can never really, similar to, I do a lot of speaking at conferences, you also can't prepare for things like that. I remember being at a conference before, you could just never prepare for the kind of things that will happen. I remember being at a speaker's dinner, and there was this new speaker, and she was extremely well prepared. There's like really good presentation, like real big expert. And I remember all this preparation, and then she walked onto stage, and you know when you get the clicker on stage, and she like dropped it and it fell through a gap in the stage, so she said couldn't get it back. But how do you prepare for that? I don't know if, even as an experienced speaker, I don't know what you're supposed to do. Like, you go over to the laptop and you start pressing the button instead. But there are some things like that you just like can't prepare. Sometimes bad things happen and you can't really do anything about it. But I'd say with M&A, you have to just understand what your criteria is. If we had turned up to that same meeting, the seller was up and ready, put his suit on, had his like best tie on, turned up on time, 30 minutes early, everything ready, but then was trying to explain to the buyers why the business has declined in revenue by 10% in the last month. They were a very sophisticated firm. They definitely would not have gone ahead with that transaction. That was one of their deal breakers. They would only buy businesses which are growing. And there's no world where anyone, even with discretion to write a check of that size internally, was going to get past that. Whereas you can get past the seller being unprofessional. But Joe, to your point, a lot of the people in the room had never seen anything like that before. They were like, well, we're used to dealing with like sophisticated law firm, investment bank, accounting firm, and founder on that side who's all going to be suited and booted. And we're dealing with the guy who's just kind of sat through a meeting and turned up hungover and is then asking for like coffee at 1 o'clock when we turned up late.
I mean, clearly.
Yes.
That's hilarious. Was he an engineer? I mean, he was the owner, but was he an engineer? Yeah, okay. So many engineers are like that, yeah.
Very technical. I can't tell you what the deal is, but some people might be able to put 2 and 2 together, because he now tells stories about it on the similar side, saying how like he hired us as an M&A firm, but I was basically like his babysitter. So he thinks it's hilarious. So it's funny now everyone got paid and the deal closed, but at the time I remember thinking, wow, this is not really what I signed up for when I launched an M&A firm. But I mean, things like that happen on every deal. There's always unexpected things, and ultimately that's what you get paid for. A lot of people are like, why should I pay all this money to sell my business? It's not because you technically know how to do the deal. Yes, that's important, but there are just things that we've seen, because it's happened over 1,500 times. I've seen it before. You would never see it as a seller, and that can be the difference between a deal closing and a deal not closing. So you're kind of paying for the years of experience. You're not paying for the hours of work put into it. Because obviously this is not really how it works, but if I can solve a problem in 10 minutes because I've seen it before, and someone else can solve that same problem in 1,000 hours because they haven't seen it before, in that hourly rate model, you'd pay the person that took 1,000 hours, they would get paid much more than me, or the team, or whatever it might be. But that's obviously, in the world of M&A, you need to come to the solution as quick as possible, so it shouldn't really matter how long it takes. It's all about having the right answer, and that's often just experience based. Can't really get around that with time.
No, I love that example. It's definitely applicable for SaaS. you very often have non-Wall Street guys, or it's not often that a founder selling a SaaS B2B business previously was like a lawyer or something who kind of had that mentality. Engineers, I grew up in Washington and around Seattle, so as you mentioned, so many people I grew up around were programmers and engineers, so it's always hilarious to me whenever there's a story like that, so I do like that story. I've had to do my fair share of kid gloving. And not to be, speaking down at these guys. Obviously, they're very smart people. Obviously, they're very capable people. It's just a cultural thing for the right behavior at the right moment, very often, and as exemplified in that story. So that's a really cool story. I want another story now. You kind of whet my appetite because that story was cool, and I felt like it was easy to listen to and very helpful. Now, Omeed, though, it kind of looks like you're on the edge of your chair.
Thomas, were you going to say something?
No, I was trying to think of that story.
Yeah, if I can add in terms of the story, I'd love one that would have to do with negotiations. If there's like a good, juicy negotiation story,
or like an issue came up in a way you guys met a middle ground on it. Like the seller wanted this and the buyer wanted this. Maybe that's the way you could go, or the seller wanted to back out, or I don't know. Either way, wanted to back out, and there's a way you guys were able to pull them in. There's a lot of ways this could go.
Yeah, so we worked on a deal recently. It did successfully close. Two founders, one very technical, one not so technical. It was like the business guy, and then the other one who was the product guy, essentially. Again, sophisticated private equity firm on the buyer side. No one had ever seen all of these issues before because they were shocked that it's not how they learned it at school, and this is not how it works when you get your MBA. But again, the partner had seen it. They had two businesses, the one business they were selling, and then a new business that they had launched, and they wanted to keep running, but competed, essentially. It was, one was a course business with a bunch of IP, and then one was a software business with some IP, but there was overlap in terms of the course and the software business without giving away too much confidential information. So the seller said, well, we're selling this business, we're going to run our new business, and we need to be able to continue to run our new one without any restrictions. But obviously, big problem was the content, and a big problem was the ongoing use of that content and what they would do on a continuous basis. The buyers were very hard line. Their lender, I think, had a covenant, which is they had to own the IP. There was no way around it. And then the sellers were adamant that there's no way their new business could run without access to the IP on an ongoing basis. So, I mean, essentially we got to a stage where there was essentially no deal to be done. But what we ended up putting together was a license agreement where the buyer owned all of the content. The sellers then licensed it back on a perpetual basis, but with a bunch of different conditions whereby they could only use it with very restricted use. But it continued to have the seller's name on it, which they liked because then their new business got credited. And then there was some incentive. So you guys are attorneys, and this obviously is the law, but a lot of it is all about the spirit of it, which was, while the contract said what they could do or what they couldn't do, the buyers would only trust the sellers if they had incentive for both businesses to do well. Yeah. And then the sellers would only have incentive if the buyers did not have incentive to screw them over. So we had a license agreement. The sellers didn't own because they thought they had to own the content. They were like, well, I made this content. I'm not selling it. I'm selling the business, but not the content. But actually turned out ultimately care about owning it. They cared about having the rights to it. But if you just look black and white in the negotiation, that's not actually what they said. So the creative solution was a license agreement, but the black and white negotiation was, no, we need the content. And then we agreed the buyer's benefit, which was the seller's new business. The buyer would have an option to buy that business in future at a pre-agreed kind of valuation multiple if certain things occurred. So the buyer had a little bit of protection. The sellers had a little bit of protection because instead of just agreeing a number, we agreed a multiple, which meant if it did really well, they would have a second liquidity event in their lives. And if it didn't do very well, then the buyers wouldn't want to buy it anyway. So they'd be able to continue running it. So things like that, I think often, so that's one of many examples, but often people are very black and white with what they think they want, but the solution is not necessarily that. There's a creative way to get around something because you really have to get to the bottom of that ultimate motivation. It wasn't actually ownership, it was actually just credit. He just wanted his name on the content. Didn't actually want to own it. He wanted to be able to point to it and be like, well, I'm the world expert on this topic, so my name has to be on it. But that's not how it was worded. It was, I have to own it. This has to be mine. I have to be able to do what I want with it because I wrote it in the first place and I must be able to continue to write it, which is where you get into this was a multi-jurisdiction, very messy deal from that perspective. So things like non-competes wouldn't necessarily have helped because it would have been very difficult to enforce them, or maybe even, again, I'm not an attorney, but probably contractually impossible to enforce them cross-jurisdiction, like lots of different countries involved. It just wouldn't have worked. So there needs to be that. Ultimately, we got the buyers comfortable because the sellers had incentive to help them and they could get it past their lender. And the sellers are comfortable and they now feel like they have a win-win. At the time, it was extremely contentious, but I know speaking to the seller recently, they're super happy. It seems to be doing quite well. So it was a win-win in the end. But at the time, it felt like an insurmountable issue. No textbook tells you how to get around.
I love that story, and it really strikes. Well, obviously, because the resolution was a legal, contractual one, it strikes near and dear to my heart. But I love that, and that creative ability to understand what everybody's interests are and how you can solve for them is so important. And somebody who doesn't know all of the different legal types of things that can be agreed to as part of a transaction, a first-time buyer or seller, would definitely not be able to do that. I think that's great. And also, I want to touch on the human element there too. Like, how hard was it to get the buyer to agree to that? I think the buyer might have been easier to agree to that because understanding a license arrangement with strict terms was probably easier for the buyer than the seller to explain to them and to get them co-opted to that plan. I'm just guessing.
Yeah, they understood it. What took longer, this would be an even longer story, is the actual like terms of the license agreement because, the buyers wanted to get paid for that license and the sellers didn't necessarily want to pay for it. But for various reasons, there had to be some consideration involved. So the buyers conceptually understood it, but they got a little bit, greedy financially, and then so did the sellers. So yes, they conceptually understood it, but that did not necessarily mean, and all of their modeled out numbers made perfect sense, but the seller was not going to move, and it got emotional to the stage where he almost felt like there's always a bit of a balance. He thought it was almost like some sort of like criminal activity, like he was being robbed of his play. They were trying to steal his business. So people can go down, I would describe it to my team as like a conspiracy rabbit hole. People are like, wow, like this person's trying to screw me over. They've gone through this big elaborate process to steal my content because I'm a genius and I'm the only person that knows anything about this industry. So you guys know this, often you just have to talk people off a bit of a hypothetical cliff and get them back to kind of focused on the deal itself. And a lot of it's that's why the rapport and like liking each other is so important, because if you don't have that, deals like that would 100% fall apart because there's no respect. I think in this case, the buyers were sophisticated enough from a negotiation perspective to understand that private sellers who, like first-time entrepreneurs who are successful, are going to be very emotional about their business. They're not the big corporation negotiating. Like a flippant comment here or there actually does make a really big difference. They would often pick up on really small stuff and they'd be like, well, Thomas, but in this meeting we had in person, they said this and now they're doing this, which means that they're definitely trying to screw us over. But to your point, in a much bigger firm, they'd be like, well, attorneys are often terse. If an attorney is terse, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. It just often that's just kind of par for the course. It's kind of the personality you expect, particularly with the bigger law firms. It's just kind of the nature. I know often like dealing with our attorney, or send them a long email with a bunch of questions. He'll send me like 3 letters back, which is some sort of acronym. And I'm like, does that mean, sometimes I'll even get self-conscious of like, oh, maybe about like, should I not be doing that? Do I need to call him and clarify what he means? Or does he literally just mean, yes, this is fine? Yeah. So there's often a lot of importance on building that rapport. And I know that deal, I think a lot of people think that the whole world can be run remotely. Deals can always be done remotely without ever in-person meetings. I definitely think, actually, both of the deals I mentioned are stories, neither of them would have happened without an in-person meeting because it felt that extra level of rapport. And I think I don't know if this is a hill I would die on as a statement, but I think it's harder to walk away from a deal if you've met the other party in person. I definitely think it helps. Sometimes it can be detrimental if you get on less well in person. A lot of people kind of have like phone voice and they'll be more formal on the phone, and then in person they're actually way worse. I think most of the time it's harder to walk away if you've met in person. So
Good point.
regardless of the size of your deal, my personal recommendation would be always try and meet if you can, particularly towards the end of the transaction when invariably there'll be at least one or two contentious points. I've seen deals close over the years which not objectively should never have closed, but, well, I guess let's call a spade. Objectively should never have closed, but did because the buyer and seller had met and the seller and buyer actually like trust each other and they're like, you know what, let's do it. This business is mostly what I thought it was. And the seller thinks the buyer is mostly what I thought it was. And if they're successful, I trust that I'm going to get paid ultimately, which is really, I get this is not how the law works, but I mean, essentially,
Yeah, no, I get
but
it.
with most contracts, unless there's a problem, people just follow the contract. You should really have any like risks or problems. You only really have a contract problem if someone like breaches it or like a business doesn't do well. No one's looking to like sue for a random point in the contract if they double the business in a year. No one
If
goes
people
back
are
on
happy,
that
they're not going to
on things like that. I mean, obviously you can, but the majority of people are not nefarious actors.
Yeah.
And will kind of they'll not do that, assuming everything else works out okay.
That's a good way to look at it.
Generally,
Unless you're Carl Icahn.
yeah. I mean, there are obviously definitely exceptions, but in my experience, if buyers do well, they'll just get on with their lives and they'll view it as a kind of win-win for everyone.
No. That's another great story. I'm really happy we got here. Omeed, go ahead.
Yeah, I think for the remainder of the conversation, those absolutely were two really great stories. I think there might be something there for you, Thomas, maybe like a book of stories or something, like, children's illustrated M&A stories or something. I was just saying that he's a really great storyteller. That was
Don't take
the
him
point
down.
of that.
Don't take him down the path of writing a book because he's focused. I can tell he has really great focus. We shouldn't encourage losing that focus.
Yeah. So,
I could definitely go down a rabbit hole of M&A stories, but I think it's in my future, not in 2024.
Agreed. And maybe it's in the future of having you again to tell more stories and talk more about it on the podcast.
yeah, would love that. But for the remainder of the conversation, I think, given the fact that, you present on so many different networks and platforms and your positioning with FE and so on and so forth and how many deals you've done, I'd love to get your insights, on the market. What are you seeing? What did you see in 2024? What was exciting you then? What are you seeing now? These sorts of types of questions.
Trends.
Yeah, so I mean, headline, if you wanted like a kind of snippet that everyone always wants, particularly when you're into it on TV, they always want like, what's your like one like hook? Like we saw a second half of 2023 versus second half of 2022, a 56% increase in deal volume. Whereas a lot of people thought that basically no deals happened in 2022 or 2023. But I think the reality is the second half of 2023 definitely picked up. And the world of Main Street, lower middle market, and even middle market M&A is completely different from multi-billion dollar deals that are happening. Back to my like American dream kind of story, you interview people who want to buy a business. That number, and I do not have any data for this, but my guess would be the number of people that buy a business, if you interview 100 random people on the street, probably does not increase or decrease cyclically. People always want to buy a business. The same percentage of people want to buy a business, regardless of the market cycle. That doesn't necessarily mean they can, but there's always that desire. So small businesses will always change hands. There'll always be M&A because there's always people who want to buy those businesses, and sellers often want to get out for quite subjective reasons, which you can't kind of, again, they're not cyclical, like being tired or having another idea or wanting to do something else or wanting to retire or wanting to stop or just want to take some chips off the table. That's not cyclical. It might be correlated to cycles, but a lot of businesses are also counter-cyclical. Some businesses do well in a recession, other businesses don't do so well in a recession. Some did really well in COVID, some did not do well in COVID. There's every single cycle you can have an excuse for doing really well or really badly. I think that's another way to kind of look at it. Those deals are always happening. So overall, the market was actually reasonably good, picking up 2024, picking up even more interest. Don't have a crystal ball, but I think most analysts on Wall Street are predicting that the Fed will lower rates this year. I think most people, the consensus is probably there'll be 3 rate cuts in 2024. And while no one really knows, it's at least the perception or belief that that's likely to happen makes buyers, I think most people would at least believe that there's not going to be increases in rates in 2024. So I think buyers are getting a little bit more confident again, particularly if they're using debt or a lender, or if this is a really small deal, maybe they're using an SBA loan. Interest rates are definitely important. So people are getting a little bit more confident from that perspective. And then outside of that, there's always new business models which are kind of hot and growing. So recently we've been seeing a lot of AI related businesses. I actually did an interview on Bloomberg yesterday, and one of the things I said there, I'm going to repeat it just because I thought it was a good quote, is one of the things I like about AI, and I think is interesting, even though I'm not the world's biggest AI expert, is every single business in the world could be improved in some way with the application of AI, where some of the other trends over the last 2 or 3 years, and again, I don't pretend to be an expert, like crypto, for example, crypto in the vast majority of businesses probably isn't really that important, or blockchain couldn't really necessarily improve it, whereas every business can be improved with AI, even if it's just as simple as using ChatGPT to help you format an email, or back to my earlier example, make a formula in Excel or do some basic research. I think every business can be improved. So we've seen a lot of businesses recently on the buy and sell side, a lot of demand for companies related to AI. I think it's an interesting space that probably isn't going away anytime soon. We have a bunch of deals launching in January, either already or the upcoming, and a lot of them have that AI component. And I think that will be a big trend in 2024, just because more businesses are figuring out how it's applicable. And if you have no idea how it's applicable, you could buy a business in the space and then you kind of skip the learning curve by buying something that's riding the wave and applying to your business, particularly if you have a portfolio of companies. So I think that's a really interesting space. And I'm generally not someone who likes to ride trends at all, but I just think because of the broad application, I think every business is going to change. So I definitely think that's something that's going to big opportunity for lots of people in lots of different ways.
It's a huge trend. I actually have some quick follow-up questions on that, if I may.
Sure.
And I try not to focus too much on the AI trend myself, because sometimes I kind of feel like now I'm jumping on the bandwagon. On the other hand, it is a huge trend and it's not going anywhere. So I want to ask something that's very often on my mind, but I don't have any good data on, is do you have a feel of what, this is the multiple question we alluded to earlier, just the annoying question. But for AI businesses, have you seen a willingness of buyers to pay an over normal multiple when compared with the traditional SaaS business? So if you'd say you very often see a 4x multiple with AI businesses, you very often see buyers willing to pay for the same business. It's hard to say same business, but
I get the question. I think in short, no. The comps and the valuations we're generally looking at are quite similar to an equivalent software business, whether it's got the AI component or not. I guess depending on the uniqueness, I always think, and similar to if you ask me the same question, which is someone willing to pay more for a business with 1 million people on an email list versus 0 people on an email list? My textbook answer would be the value is intrinsically baked in based on the value of that email list. So if those 1 million emails you have are so good, then that's going to be generating revenue, brand goodwill, and other things already. If it has no value, it's not going to be driving anything. Therefore, it's worth nothing. So the same with AI. Saying you have AI does not necessarily mean the value is driven by AI. And if it is, that's already something that would have driven up the valuation. So that's always how I look at it from that perspective, which is people do not pay more because it's AI, but because it is AI, it might be worth more because it's growing at a faster rate or has lower churn or has lower cost of acquisition because it's easier to acquire customers. So there's lots of factors from that perspective, but being AI does not suddenly make your business worth more. I think you just have to look at it from a slightly different perspective. And I say, in general, one, I say that you shouldn't always negotiate off a spreadsheet, and you should have things that are important. You shouldn't worry too much about the multiple you're paying on the way in if you think you can grow the business. Ultimately, that's still how the vast majority of deals happen. So it's not like every single deal, one buyer is going to pay double the valuation of everyone else because they see something that everyone else doesn't. The vast majority of deals have a relatively tight range of where bidders will come in, and that hasn't really changed over the years. It doesn't really change with AI. I don't think there's any stupid money in the AI space at the moment where people are deploying money at all costs, and they're like, well, we'll pay any multiple because we think that AI is the future. We haven't seen any of that. It would certainly make my job easier if that was the case. But I think there's capital going into that space, but it's not, I guess what I'd describe as like irrational money. They're approaching deals in a sensible way.
I do hear you. It makes sense what you said. It's very clear. I guess there's a curious point remaining in my mind, and this is not a rebuttal or a response to what you said, but more so just a ponderance that I kind of have sitting there is that, well, a big thing that's not quantifiable with AI businesses is the competitive advantage that, depending on its tech stack, that it may have. And it's kind of like with SaaS businesses. I guess I'm not trying to compare it directly to SaaS business. What I'm trying to say very simply is, if it's an AI business that might not have it shown in its financials that it's going to have a really big moat, but they're just an industry leader in this market, wouldn't that non-quantifiable point contribute to a higher multiple? But I guess the response to that would be, well, it's a case-by-case basis. And if it's a strategic buyer who really understands the technology and it's being competitively priced, then I guess it could be priced.
I say again, like kind of disagreeing with my previous point, it might lead to a higher valuation just because of the fact there'll be more buyers interested. So if you have 10 buyers interested versus 3 who are going to make an offer, all else being equal, the business with 10 bids is going to sell for more because chances are more likely going to get someone or get the bidders up by a higher percentage on average. Obviously, deal by deal, that's not necessarily the case, but on average, yes, that will be the case. So being in a whole space does have other benefits just because you'll get that extra interest, but by itself does not necessarily mean it's worth more. And if there is this business is AI, therefore it's going to make more in future, the way you'd structure that generally is an earn-out. Well, if that is true, seller, then as a buyer, yes, I'm willing to pay you for that future upside, but that's going to be contingent based. So if that happens, I'll pay you more in the form of an earn-out or rolled equity or whatever it might be, but some sort of kind of, if there's speculative upside, there needs to be so the buyer is not going to pay that in cash up front. They're going to want the seller to have some skin in the game with that statement. And I'm also a big believer when it comes to deal structuring. Almost anything can be legally structured into a deal based on what someone claims. So if you think the business is going to be doubled as a seller, that's fantastic. We'll find you a buyer who's willing to pay for that if you're willing to put your money where your mouth is when it comes to kind of deal structure, if it's an earn-out or whatever. And you'll often kind of figure out how much someone believes their position if they're willing to put it in a contract.
Okay, no, totally. No, I really appreciate your thoughts there. I have no further follow-ups on that. It's such an interesting topic. We live in those times, and 2024 is definitely going to be a very interesting year for just seeing, more AI companies mature and new tech and stuff in that space. But Omeed, I've taken over your line of questioning, so I'll throw it back to you.
No, it was great. I love it. Yeah, so to kind of round out the right now aspect in terms of what are you seeing, where are you focusing, what's exciting, what are you dreading?
I'm a relatively optimistic person, so I don't really dread a huge amount. And like I said, I don't really chase trends, but I think that helps me sleep at night because we don't have like key man or key risk in our business where I'm like, well, if industry X, like tech M&A is not going away. Will certain subsectors of tech get more popular or less popular? Yes. But we kind of have intentionally built a boring business. Like, will people want to buy businesses in 2034 and 2094? I'm almost 100% certain the answer to that question is yes. And will people who own businesses want to sell them in 2034 and 2094? Yes. So from that perspective, are we building some sort of like disruptive technology? No, absolutely not. But from that perspective, maybe the only thing I dread is like sometimes you might miss the boat on trends because of the fact we've decided to build the business in a very kind of sustainable way and like do things we're good at, compound things we're good at, go up market, do bigger deals, hire more people, close more deals overall. But no, I generally don't dread. I'm generally a pretty optimistic person from that perspective.
I mean, we love to hear that. The name of our law firm is Optimist Legal, so we definitely understand being an optimist. But the spirit of the question is less about, the dread aspect and more about risk identification. So is there anything that you see as potential pitfalls for people in the market currently, or you can even maybe point to something that you saw last year?
I don't think there really are, honestly, because I think
talking in respect to buyer and seller. Yeah.
Honestly, I think my answer would be very similar. I don't think there's really been anything I've noticed. I'd say because we're very much word of mouth driven, we've never really been chasing trends. So that trend answer applies to everything. And we don't force sellers into selling who aren't really keen on selling. We don't force people to buy businesses who aren't really looking to buy. So generally people have come to their own conclusion by themselves. So I'd say from that perspective, I sleep quite well at night just because I don't think there's a huge amount that if someone's made their mind up on doing something, they're going to do it whether or not. Doesn't matter what I tell them, they're going to do it anyway. But just at the same time, I believe the opposite as well, which is if someone does not want to buy something, you can be good at negotiating, but you can't persuade someone to fundamentally change their mind on whether or not they would like to buy a business or not buy a business. Yeah, you can give them some like pros and cons or some selling points, but ultimately they have to come to their own conclusion. You can point them in the right direction and give them some like suggestions, but that you can't force them to change their mind legally or otherwise.
Joe, was there something that you said too, Joe?
No, I was just pointing the direction of the question. Nothing bad.
Gotcha. And then what about like long view? So I heard you kind of point to, what you're seeing is AI. Is there anything that you would add in terms of like longer view? Right now, like AI is, obviously very kind of trend topic and so on and so forth. And it's expected to continue well into the future because, the advancement of AI is only going to compound over time. Like, we're at ChatGPT 4, but I think, when they did a demo or whatever of, the more advanced ChatGPT, it's going to be ridiculously more effective in its power and ability of application. But outside of that,
yeah, I mean, I think in the echo chamber we all live in, like the whole world is already tech, so like tech is the whole world. But I think the reality is the way I look at tech. I don't know, that's a very generic term, but a lot of businesses, particularly, use essentially no technology at all. And so, like, personal story, I have a house in California, and when we bought our house a couple of years ago, we kind of inherited a yard guy who would kind of maintain the yard. The seller gave us his number, so everything's like via text, and he gets paid by check every month. Basically doesn't change his prices. He just comes and does a good job all the time. If you want to pay him with any form of technology, it doesn't do it. Nothing is managed via technology. If he has it, he'll do the novelty thing of coming to knock on the door and telling you if there's a problem. He'll do that. There's literally zero technology used in that business. And then we also have a pool. Our pool company come exactly same. We inherited it from the seller of the house, and they just come every week. If there's a problem, they text us. You pay them by check. You want anything tech related, they have no idea. They just kind of run their business in the same way. So I think a lot of people live in this echo, and I certainly did as well, live in this like echo chamber of tech. Like, oh, everyone must use tech. Everyone must use like kind of a CRM. Everyone must use like Stripe. Everyone must do all of these other things. But the reality is lots of people and lots of businesses haven't really adopted technology at all. So when I see things like that, obviously the entrepreneur in me wants to go, my wife would always stop me, but the entrepreneur in me would always want to go tell them how to run their business better and be like, oh, you can sign up for a Stripe account and then they can pay you on recurring credit card rather than check because I can't find my pen or my checkbook. But I think when I see things like that, I'm kind of optimistic about the future because, yeah, multiples will go up and down year on year. Yeah, interest rates can change, but ultimately there's still huge number of people who aren't really using technology at all. And when they do, they'll, like, for example, the business model of SaaS, which is something we're probably best known for in the world of tech M&A. Like, there's a SaaS business for everything. If you are a yard company and you want to accept recurring payments from your customer like me who just wants to pay a credit card, there's lots of products out there that help you do that. So the adoption is only going to grow as more and more of these kind of companies become a bit more, not necessarily tech savvy. I mean, they have a great business and they probably like their life without technology other than a cell phone. But I think there's a lot of people live in a bit of a bubble where they assume that kind of, oh, you hear things like tech is saturated, but that's because you're an engineer and your 10 closest friends are engineers and you believe that everyone knows how to code. the reality is that's not really how the world works at all. Lots of people have no idea and they have no interest and they just don't. So lots of people kind of get this confirmation bias from very small like echo chambers they're in. But the reality is, like, I think the future's pretty good for the world of tech and the world of SaaS, because you can build a business and the total addressable market might only be X today, but it can be X times a factor of a lot as more and more of these companies adopt. And it's very difficult to kind of predict how that's going to happen. And you can't cold email my yard guy and be like, hey, do you want to sign up for this product? Because he'll just say, sorry, I'm busy kind of cutting grass today. I have no interest in signing up and buying a laptop and doing all of these things. So I know that for me, that was like quite enlightening, because I definitely lived in a bit of a bubble where I was used to everything being done in an online portal and wasn't really used to it at all.
I hear you. No, that's a good point. That's a good point. I definitely do. I think I do myself, just a quick comment back, live a little bit in that bubble too. I mean, both Omeed and I have traveled a lot and stuff, so we're definitely not like SF lifers, like San Francisco Bay Area lifers or anything. Those guys can live in a bubble for sure. But I hear your point. I mean, now that we've hit our mark, though, on the time, just to stay to schedule, we should go ahead and wrap it up.
Yeah, I just have one last question to kind of close us out. What's the number one indicator you check, for the market more than all the others? Like, what do you look to? And the intention of that question is just to kind of get a sense of kind of how to think like Thomas.
The number one indicator I would personally look at, so two things I would look at just to get general sentiment, would be number of buyer inquiries and number of seller inquiries in a week or over a month. Like, we track that quite closely. So that doesn't necessarily mean, like I said, like just because someone wants to buy doesn't mean they will buy, but sentiment is definitely important, and there's generally correlation between like the number of people that inquire and the number of people that actually end up making offers. If you only speak to, the data pretty much supports this. If you speak to 10 buyers and you speak to 1,000 buyers, the company that speaks to 1,000 buyers is going to get more offers than the one that speaks to 10, even with all the caveats of, what if the 10 are super targeted or the best buyers in the world? Like, the data suggests the more you speak to, the better. So I don't like very basic metrics like that, but I think from a sentiment perspective, they're the two things I personally track quite closely. People are continuing to inquire about selling, then there's not been any sort of fundamental shift. And our data is kind of up and to the right with that kind of consistently increasing number of inquiries month on month, year on year, even if they're not necessarily ready to pull the metaphorical trigger tomorrow.
Great. Awesome. Yeah, Thomas, really enjoyed having you on the show.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Cool. Thanks so much, guys. It was great to meet you.
It was a pleasure to have you.
And everyone out there, thanks for joining us for another episode of SaaS Buyers Club. I'm your host, Omeed.
I'm your co-host, Joe.
And this week we interviewed Thomas from FE International. You'll be able to find all his contact information in the show notes below. And as always, please subscribe, like, follow, comment, and thanks for being here. See you next week.